Tá bom? Então, esse é o nosso programa de hoje. Temos para isso vários apresentadores. Vamos começar, então, pelo programa com a doutora Monika Zurek, da Universidade de Oxford. Ela é formada em Biologia Agrícola pela Universidade de Hohenheim. Me desculpe se o nome não é bem esse, não é pronunciado assim. PhD em Economia Agrícola pela Justus Liebig da University Gießen, de Alemanha. Por favor, eu não sei falar alemão. É pesquisadora sênior do Instituto de Mudança Ambiental da Universidade de Oxford e membro do ECI Food Systems Group. Doutora Monika, the floor is yours. You are very welcome. Your sound is not on, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the conference here. It sounds like you already had a wonderful first day, and I'm quite glad I'm able to speak and discuss the topic of resilience, particularly food system resilience, with you all today. So one of the key things we've definitely learned in the pandemic, but we also were discussing it long before that, was that if we really want to build resilient societies, one of the key factors for all of that is having resilient food systems. And as the pandemic showed us, there are quite a few entry points of vulnerability in our current very globalized food system. So no matter which country we're talking, we saw issues with food supply. We saw people, having access issues to food. Food prices are currently going up again. But what we know, if we want to realize the Sustainable Development Goals, we definitely need to think about how to transform our current food system. And that means we need to understand really how a food system functions, what drives the decisions of decision makers in these food systems, how can they deal with the risks that are coming down the track for food systems. It also means that we might have to explore different plausible futures about how food systems could evolve in order to really provide healthier diets, because we still have a problem with hungry people as much as with obese people that is growing by the minute. A lot of food systems are not equitable in terms of providing access for everybody to food. And we, of course, know about the huge environmental footprint of our current food system, no matter in which country we're talking. And so there's definitely a lot of things we need to think about if we want to avoid potentially catastrophic risks for many societies around the globe. And as I said, COVID-19 has just exposed a lot of the entry points for vulnerability in many of our food systems, and shown us also where the uncertainty lies in these systems. Let me start by first giving you two slides just on what I mean by a food system, because there are a lot of definitions. Everybody uses the word, and of course they're used in very different ways. So the way of how we in my group in Oxford think about a food system is more than just the value chain. So of course we have the production side in any food system on the one end and the consumption side on the other end. And in the middle, all the different things that basically, change crops and livestock products into food that we actually have on our plate. So the processing, the wholesaling and retailing, the storing, the waste disposal. So all of these activities are part of what we today have, these very complex interacting webs of food systems across the globe. But that's only one so to say, the core part of the system, if we want to really think about how we change all of that, we also need to understand, on the one side, what comes out of the system. So are we achieving the food and nutrition security that we are aiming for? What is the environmental footprint of the whole system, and what are the socioeconomic and the equity outcomes of the system in any country around the world? Food systems, if you take the whole thing, not just the production side, but through retailing, catering, all the different activities, the food sector is one of the most important sectors in any economy around the world. Brazil is definitely a very important player in providing, a lot of crops to the rest of the world. Here in the UK, for example, the food sector is the biggest manufacturing sector overall. So it's a real important economic and livelihood provider as well. So in order to understand what comes out of the system, as I say, we need to understand the shape and the relationship between the different actors, but we also need to understand what drives them and what conditions the decision that actors make within a system, what's the supporting environment and what's the institutional environment, and what are feedback loops between outcomes and driving forces. So all of these are important considerations when we actually start entering into this territory of food system change, which I think a lot of you will agree that our food systems are functioning currently suboptimal. And food system transition is definitely something that we need to think about in a lot of different settings around the globe. The key thing is that these food systems are in the moment quite vulnerable, as I said, to a lot of different shocks and stresses. And again, COVID just exposed it, but it wasn't that we had these problems before. So there's a lot of different type of factors that are currently stressing the system, from, of course, climate change, something that's on everybody's mind, especially after the COP in Glasgow right now, where food and agriculture is currently one of the big emitters globally, and at the same time will be hit very hard by any kind of climate impacts. And we are not adapting fast enough in many regions of the world to deal with the climate impacts. But then, of course, geopolitics, demographic changes, all of these, either gradually or suddenly, as the pandemic shows, can really change how the system works. And COVID, as I said, is just one of the biggest shocks that we had in a very short time that led to a lot of changes in the food system. And how do we deal with all of that? And if we look at what the World Economic Forum said in its report about global risks, a lot of the risk, climate risk and extreme weather, really top of the list nowadays, together with infectious diseases. All of these will be impacting the food system tremendously. And we need to find ways of better dealing with these potential vulnerabilities in each of the different systems we are working with. So if we then say, we need to enhance the resilience of the food system, what does that actually mean? Here's a definition from the ETH Zurich, so University in Zurich in Switzerland, around what we could think food system resilience constitutes, which basically is the capacity over time of a system and its units at multiple levels to provide sufficient, adequate, and accessible food to all in the face of various unforeseen disturbances. That relates, of course, just to the food security outcome. It doesn't talk about any of the other outcomes that I just mentioned that food systems have in terms of environment, livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So, what it also says is that, as we have this very complex set of actors interacting with each other, there are very different perspectives and views on what actually the problem is that we need to address, and how can we base this on the best of science, on the best of evidence that we have available, in order to find a way forward and hence create food system resilience. What I want to talk about today is a research program that my group in Oxford is currently coordinating. So I'm part of that coordinating unit. It's about £15 million program that was started in 2016, funded by the main research councils in the UK on what does resilience, enhancing the resilience of the UK food system in a global context really mean. For that, the Research Council funded in total 13 different projects on a set of 3 different themes over the last 5 years to kind of investigate what does resilience mean within different food sectors and for the system as a whole. And what I want to present to you today is basically some of the key findings, as the program will be finishing in December. We are just gearing up for a big final conference in the second week of December in London. Presenting a lot of the findings, discussing these with decision makers within the UK, and actually from a number of OECD countries as well. I wanted to show what we learned over these 5 years. So here are the 3 topics within the program. So one, there were projects that were addressing the production end of the food system. There were a number of projects looking at the middle bit, basically within the food sector, and of course the consumer side was also addressed in terms of the different type of projects that were there. There were 3 different levels of, so we had a first set of projects looking, for example, into the pig industry, looking into the whole issue of imported food, particularly bananas, which is quite vulnerable currently to a number of diseases, and is the most eaten fruit within the UK. But then also projects like I Know Food that look across the whole food system. Another round of projects looked, for example, about the issue of phosphorus in the food system and what vulnerabilities are rising from there, the issue of losing pollinators, how to better manage landscapes with ruminants on them, and we also had a number of projects around seafood, for example, around the issue of providing resilient food systems to cities. So there was quite a range of different type of projects as part of the overall program, all looking into different aspects of the UK food systems and the vulnerabilities they're facing. One of the things that we learned as a set of researchers across all these different projects was definitely that there are a lot of different ways of framing resilience. And all the different actors in the system have very different ideas about, what resilience is and how to define it. And so what we ended up saying was basically for each of the different projects, what became very important was to ask 4 very basic questions before we even started with a lot of the work. And that really meant is resilience of what? So is it the whole system that we want to make resilience? Is it different actors in the system? Is it different outcomes of the system that we want to make resilience? Resilience to what? What are the specific shocks that the system that we are looking at is facing? From whose perspective? Because one of the big things that we know from food systems transformation research is that there always will be different winners and losers, and there are very different perspectives that people have on the possible changes that are coming down the track, and then over what time period. So starting out with these simple questions, it helped us to understand, do we want to make the actual structure of the system that actually is not providing us what we really want in an optimal way right now? Or do we actually want to make the outcomes of the system resilient? And differentiating between these two, you would come up with very different strategies of what you would do for resilience building. Then, of course, the whole issue of resilience to what? Are these long-term stresses that have long-term trends like climate change, for example, or demographic shifts, that we have to deal with, or do we have to deal with these so-called black swans? So unimagined or rare events like the pandemic that somehow we know can happen, but don't happen very often, and then usually at a smaller scale. But, what is it that we have to deal with? Because again, there are differences between the two in terms of working with these. So here you see a whole bunch of potential stresses to the food system that came out in the different projects. And here you see a number of sudden surprising events, and depending on what you're dealing with, you have to think of very different responses to these. So then, of course, from whose perspective, as I said, we have a lot of different actors in the system with very different motivations, and from whose perspective should we build resilience? From the perspective of the consumers who want to have the shelves filled with as much food as possible, from the perspective of the farmers and the fishermen that are producing something, from the perspective of the food industry or the retailers. So that is very important to consider. And then over what time period? Are we talking about short-term interruptions, or are we talking about long-term disruptions? And each of these aspects will require very different responses to how we actually can enhance the resilience of the system.
Dr. Monika, just remember 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So what we then learned is that different communities really define resilience in very different ways. And basically, based on that, there are 3 different strategies for enhancing the resilience of food system outcomes, which is what we as a societal level focused on. On the one side, you can build robustness, basically aiming to resist any kind of disruptions, versus building a recoverable system that can bounce back after shock, to the same level of outputs or outcomes that we have. Or we can try to hit 2 birds with 1 stone. We can aim to accept basically alternative outcomes. So try and change what comes out of the system before and after a disruption. So that basically means bound forward, or is now often here in the UK termed also as build back better. All of these require reorganizing the system. So basically doing things, the activities in the system different. And, depending on what kind of sector you work with within the system, that can be quite a lot of change for a lot of actors. And that means you have to reorganize food system activities so that you either have to adapt them or you have to transform them completely in order to come up with more resilient outcomes. So that means reorganizing the food system activities themselves. So how do we process, how do we produce, how do we consume, or what do we want as consumers on our plates? It might mean reorganizing the environments within which different actors take their decision by new policies, markets, new technologies, or it might mean really reorganizing our views of what we want out of the system. Do we want to have consuming less meat because of health or environmental implication? Do we value nutrition in a different way? Some of these will require radical transformation of the system. And how can we make sure we come up with a type of food system that serves the majority, the big part of the actors in the system? So there are different ways for enhancing resilience. We brought all of this together also in a number of publications. Of course, each of the different projects put out a whole bunch of publications, over 150, just counting right now, and there's a whole bunch of new publications coming out. And we had just authored a joint paper across all the different projects to bring all these findings into the scientific literature, which will be available in January next year, if hopefully accepted as we hope. Here are some of the key findings across all the different projects. Basically, what became clear is that there is no overall solution or just the silver bullet to enhancing resilience. All of the strategies have to be very context specific, which of course makes sense as the food system in each country is so diverse and has so many different components. Sustainability and resilience are not the same thing. Sustainability is an outcome of the system versus resilience as a property of the system. And they are very different strategies to enhance either resilience or sustainability. They can be synergistic, but they should not be mistaken for the same thing. And that is very important because in language and the way of how we often frame these, we often use them as if they are one and the same. And then enhancing food system resilience really requires a combination of what we call these 3 R's, thinking about robustness, thinking around a recoverable system, and thinking about reorientation. That is actually something that might have to happen all at the same time. We need to be very clear on what the actual management objective of resilience building is, across all these different actors, and coming up with a view across all these different actors or a vision is, as we know, not an easy thing. Thinking about specific messages for specific communities, on the government side, in order to enhance resilience, what we definitely learned is that you need to take this whole food systems perspective in order to come up with the right type of options to really transform the system towards something that societies would want. For the industry, one of the key things that came out is that it's actually really important to think about the negative relationships we currently have between food prices and health and sustainability in the food system. If you want to reorient these towards a more resilient and also sustainable set of products that you provide to consumers. NGOs do have quite a substantial role to play in really holding governments and the industry to account, and in order to build resilience and point the finger to where the current vulnerabilities are. Finance and investment sectors really need to stress test a lot of their plans with respect to the wider exposure to all these different shocks and stresses that are entering the food system in different ways. And, research is absolutely crucial to really enhance the role and support resilience building measures for the specific sectors. So again, we have a major conference coming up in December to present a lot of that. And I'm very glad I could show you some of our main results right now. We will be discussing a lot of that in much more detail. So thank you very much. And I'm happy for any questions that you might have on the topic.
Thank you, Monika. Really great. It was great to hear from you this experience with this nice project. And well, I'm trying to see if there is any question already in the, let's see. Does your research include investigations on the importance of consumption of wildlife or alternative sources of animal protein?
So I'm just looking at the just thinking through the different projects. So yes, so some of the projects that worked on whole food system approaches, for example, for cities, creating more resilient food systems for cities specifically. Also, we had a part that looked into different strategies for part of the UK, so not a commodity-based approach, but much more place-based approaches. That was part of some of the thinking. I could point you to the specific projects that were thinking about protein. I mean, there was no project that was thinking about protein alternatives per se, but it definitely came up as in a lot of the discussion with stakeholders, if we want to create more environmentally sustainable and also healthy diets, because, you know, we are over consuming meat here in the UK in terms of health considerations, you know, that part of the thinking about that was definitely in the different projects as well.
Eu imagino que nós temos aí várias perguntas a apresentar, uma vez que o projeto é tão amplo, aborda tantos itens, né? Mas, para o meu lado, eu entendi que resiliência e sustentabilidade podem não estar de mãos dadas. Como você enxerga a questão da sustentabilidade, já que falamos aí na cadeia animal, vamos usar esse exemplo da produção de carne, e a questão da resiliência? Você tem algum item, algum exemplo que você pudesse comentar conosco?
Yeah, so the issue of resilience and sustainability, the reasons why, you know, we basically, one of our findings says that they are not the same, is that we see, if we talk environmental sustainability, but we can also talk social sustainability, is part of the outcomes that you have of a well-functioning system. In the moment, though, we have this huge environmental footprint of any food system around the world. Yeah. So, but at the same time, it is really difficult to change the food system. So some of my colleagues, or we had a lot of discussion with people around that basically said, in the moment, we have something that you can call negative resilience. Yeah, because in the sense, we don't have the outcomes of the system that we want, that we need, neither in terms of health, in terms of environment, also in terms of social outcomes. But we do have a system that is actually very resilient to change. Yeah, so changing the system, food system transformation is very complex and is a very long-term process. So the issue is, this is why, you know, in our discussions, we came up with this third way of enhancing resilience that we termed reorientation of the system, where you're trying to change basically the outcomes of the system towards more sustainability, better nutrition, you know, more equitable and economically viable system. But that requires that you change the structure. Because you can only change the outcomes if you change the activities and the way of how the system works. So meaning transforming the system. And that of course, is a very complicated thing, and a lot of people are currently working on, you know, how do we create, you know, different types of food systems. In our group, what we are saying you need to do for that, we need to develop a set of what we call systemic innovations. So innovations that really look across the whole system, where you can create a joint vision across different actors in the system of where do you want to go as the first step. And then you have to translate that vision back into individual changes for actors along the way, but it's then done in a much more coordinated way than what we currently see in the system. Yeah, because right now we try to change, for example, agriculture, and with that we think we will change nutrition outcomes. It doesn't quite work like that in most cases anymore. Yeah. And so, so that whole question of food system transformation going hand in hand with resilience building is a bit currently the holy grail, I think, for our community. And I think there's quite a lot of research effort needed in order to really reorient, build resilient systems, but with better outcomes than what we currently see, because current food system outcomes are definitely suboptimal in all the key areas around the globe. So there's a lot of work ahead of us.
Isso é um bom sinal, com certeza, porque a ciência vem sempre, em todos os aspectos, em todas as áreas, vem e tem que desenvolver, não é? esse emaranhado de coisas que nós temos que ver pela frente. Eu queria agradecê-la muitíssimo, Mônica, pela apresentação. Eu imagino que todos nós entendemos a complexidade, você nos mostrou muito bem, e creio que para 5 anos de projeto, muitas coisas já foram discutidas. E agora a gente gostaria de começar a ver as ramificações desses resultados. Vamos estar acompanhando esses eventos que você nos apontou. Muito obrigada. E, surgindo novas dúvidas, a gente volta a conversar com você. Certamente, um evento só sobre isso seria necessário para muitos dias. Muito obrigada, doutora Mônica. Excelente. E agora, então...
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay. Would you like to say something else?
Just to thank you all for listening and for having me. And as you say, it's a very complex problem, but there's also a lot of new ideas that came out of our project that we hope that we can in the future test and see and bring the best of science to really helping to change the system. Thank you very much.
Excelente. Muito obrigada novamente, doutora Mônica.